Are you listening? Damn. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is the background for our slideshow this week. It's a political cartoon all about farmers. You can see the monster in the middle. He has tentacles like an octopus, but a head like a businessman with a top hat, and he has Monopoly tattooed across his forehead. And this tentacled monster is reaching out to grab a bale of cotton and wheat and a horse and a pig and a cow, and he's sitting on a sack full of money all while he's doing this, and he's going to go after the farmer now. And so this communicates the theme, one of the themes for this section of our study. It's that the farmer was under threat, and Monopoly, a business that wanted to control an entire industry, in this case farming, was trying to do this, to control the farmer and control his vote. You can see he's holding a vote in his hand, and just take control of the farmer's life. And of course, this was difficult for a farmer to accept, and so we'll be looking at not only the problems they faced, but how they united to try to change it. And we'll do that in this section of notes. From farms to factories, the United States moves from agriculture to industry. And we'll have farm noises, of course, for all of these different slides. I'll let the pigs finish there first. Just until the point where it's awkward. In the late 1800s, farmers in the United States faced a difficult world. So first, one problem they faced. Prices for crops were falling, and farmers had to mortgage their farms to buy more land and plant more crops to make up the difference. Problem with growing more crops is that the more you have of something, often the value of that something goes down. So the more and more corn you grow, the value of that corn will decrease, usually. Another problem, good farming land was becoming scarce. It was being bought up and used. Also, focus on the good farming land. Farming land was being used over and over again, and it had reached a point in some places of nutrient deterioration, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the Dust Bowl a few decades later. Railroads are taking advantage of farmers by charging high prices for shipping and storage. Railroads were the only way of transport for some of these farmers. This was before the time of highways and trucks, before the time of airplanes. A lot of these farms were landlocked. They didn't have access to the ocean, so railroads were the only transport game in town. And of course, railroads were businesses. They knew this. They wanted to make money, so they raised the cost of shipping. So these are three problems so far that farmers faced in the late 1800s, and that's from 1850 to 1900 that we're focusing on here. Another thing which changed farmers' life, it was a threat to some that made farming their living, and some that made farming their living, it was a benefit. Advances in technology, farmers would modernize. They would use things like John Deere's steel plow, Cyrus McCormick's reaper, and John Fralick's gasoline-powered tractor. And here's some pictures of these things here. You can see McCormick's reaper up in the corner here. It was used to cut down crops quickly and efficiently, whereas before they would have had to use a hand tool, a literal reaper. A person in the field would have to use it to cut down corn or wheat or whatever they were growing. The steel plow picture here in the corner, steel plow made things very efficient because steel was a great material for plowing as opposed to iron or some other metal. The soil did not get caked on the plow, and it cut through tree roots very easily. It's an overall good tool. Again, John Deere made this first, essentially made it first. And then we have the gas-powered tractor. Now, a lot of people think John Deere made the gas-powered tractor or invented it, but he did not. He just adapted it, or his company adapted it later on to use and sell. And the first guy that made a gas-powered tractor was John Fralick. And you can see one of the earlier tractors used here. A tractor became like a portable power supply for the farmer. They could use it for anything from reaping to sowing to plowing, and became indispensable. Of course, there were tractors before gas-powered tractors. There were steam-powered tractors, but today we're going to focus on, this slide we're going to focus on gas-powered tractors. So this was great for farm owners. It made farming more efficient and more cost effective. But for farm workers, people who didn't know the land and just worked on the farm, it eliminated the need for them. They lost their jobs. So this was not good. Let's quickly look at the screen here. Show a taskbar, and we'll pull up the notes, which you need to be answering here. How did farmers modernize in the late 1800s? They used those three inventions. Make sure you write those three inventions down. And why was modernization both good and bad for farmers? I think I just explained that. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Some sheep on this one. There we go. The rise of populism. Farmers fought back against all these changes and threats by forming groups to represent their interests. Two groups that they formed were the Grange, which fought against railroad abuses by teaching farmers how to organize and support legislation to regulate railroads, and the Farmers' Alliances. They sent lecturers from town to town to educate people about cooperative buying and selling of crops. The Grange is still around today. It is not as influential, not to say that farming isn't important, because of course it is. We need food. We are literally addicted to it. But the Grange was more influential in the past because more and more people made farming their way of life, their profession. And that's not the case today. Again, farming is important, but less people do it. Farmers' Alliances, I haven't seen any evidence to the fact that they are still around, but the Grange definitely is. These two groups gave rise to populism, and populism is essentially the movement of the people. But for this time period, and I want you to put this on your answer sheet, it was made up of farmers. So the Populist Party in the late 1800s was made up of farmers, essentially. And they were formed on July 2nd, 1892. Some of the things they supported, so there's 4 goals here. 3 of them you need to write down on your notes. They wanted an increase in the money supply, a graduated income tax, the election of U.S. senators by the people, and an 8-hour workday. So increase in money supply meant bimetallism. We'll talk about that in the next slide. A graduated income tax. They wanted the people who made more to pay more. The larger your income, the more you had to pay. They wanted the election of U.S. senators by the people. Before the people, you, me, and people down everywhere could vote for U.S. senators, we had to let the state legislature choose our senators. And a lot of people thought that was wrong. And that would change with a constitutional amendment in the early 20th century. And they wanted an 8-hour workday. An 8-hour workday, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for recreation. Some cows this time. Okay, like I said, just to the point where it's awkward. The fall of populism. So these farmers would be influential. Those other goals you just saw, they would be accomplished. But it was only a short-lived movement in comparison with some others. Populism would also call for bimetallism. It's a money system in which the government would give citizens either gold or silver in exchange for paper money. Such a system would increase the money supply, but raise the prices of goods and services. And the rise in the cost of goods and services is called inflation. And inflation is something we want to avoid in our economy because it takes the value of our money down. Here is a picture of a Populist Party candidate for president, William Jennings Bryan. And again, he was in favor of bimetallism. He was against the gold standard, which would only back money with gold. He made a famous speech about called the Cross of Gold speech, where he spoke out against it. He said, we should not be crucified on the cross of gold. And so in the 1896 presidential election, William Jennings Bryan was nominated by the populists. Populists liked him because he's a famous speaker, he's a lawmaker. Democrats also nominated William Jennings Bryan. Okay, so you have two political parties in this election voting, choosing one man, and then a third political party, the Republicans chose William McKinley from good old Ohio. Again, William McKinley was different from William Jennings Bryan because he believed only gold should be exchanged for paper money, and that was the gold standard. There's a picture of William Jennings Bryan, and there's a picture of William McKinley on the bottom. Let's go to the screen here. We'll show the taskbar, and we're going to pull this up again. The fall of populism. So who are the two main candidates for the presidential election of 1896? You need to write down the names and the parties that supported them. The difference between bimetallism and gold standard. Bimetallism is when gold and silver back your paper money. Gold standard is when only gold backs your paper money. Let's go back. Bryan kept an exhausting schedule. He made sometimes 20 speeches a day, but he was defeated because many people feared the rise in prices. They feared the inflation caused by bimetallism. Bryan was defeated in 1896, and populism collapsed after that. But populism showed people, and this is a positive consequence of populism, that they could organize and fight back against their abusers. The farmers had some success. They weren't ultimately successful. They didn't get their candidate elected to president, but they did get an 8-hour workday passed or an fair compensation for that workday. They did get an amendment to the Constitution, and they did get a graduated income tax later on. So this would be a good example for others later in the 20th century, like the women's rights movement, the suffrage movement for women, and the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century. Now we're moving to industry. So you heard an explosion there. So we're moving from farming to industry. We're going to talk about the rise of industry. With populism's fall, farmers also became less influential. Not less important, but less influential. The U.S. gradually moved towards an economy based more on manufacturing than on agriculture. Manufacturing, an industrial economy, not an agrarian, as one of your words, agrarian economy. The industrial boom in the U.S. was also a result of several other factors, and you need to take note of these in your questions. The industrial boom was a result of the massive amounts of natural resources in the U.S. We have lots of iron and gold and oil and corn and just a lot of different resources that we can utilize, and that made it a good place for industry to boom. The government gave a lot of support to business, tax breaks, things like that. Or if they didn't support business directly, they didn't interfere with it, they let it go and let it do what it wanted. The growth of population in cities, you have a great growth population in cities, and you have a workforce where most factories are located. You don't usually put a factory out in the middle of nowhere. You could, but why would you need a workforce for that factory? So you would put it in cities, and as the city's population grew, there was more and more workers to fuel the factories and take care of the factories. And you also have the improvement of transportation networks. You had, in 1869, you had the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad, the finishing of it, and that made transporting goods back and forth a lot easier because a lot of other railroads would branch off of that. You had different mass transit in the cities themselves, like L trains in Chicago or subways in New York, and these would become important too for transporting people back and forth from work to home and vice versa. One of the things which fueled the industrial boom was oil, black gold, Texas tea. And oil could be refined into different forms, which had a variety of uses. First off, we have kerosene. This is one of the primary purposes for oil when it started. It's used to light lamps. It was discovered how it's used to heat homes. It was discovered how to distill this fuel from oil or coal by a Canadian geologist named Abraham Gessner. And this is one of the inventors we're looking at in this unit. Here's a picture of Abraham Gessner and his kerosene lamp. You can still see those in different places. Some people still use them in their homes. but it is a little bit more dangerous now because if those fall, they're more likely to catch on fire as opposed to a light bulb. Gasoline was a byproduct of the refinement of kerosene. No one knew what to do with gasoline at first because it was explosive, it's stinky, it's sticky, and what do you do with this thing? But when people figured out that you could use this liquid to power internal combustion engines, that changed things because that engine can be used for automobiles primarily, but not only automobiles, for any type of machine. The search for and use of oil took off in 1859 when Edwin Drake drilled for it near Titusville, PA. States such as Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana followed Pennsylvania's example. We're going to go to a video here all about Mr. Edwin Drake.
At this place in history, we're in Castleton with the Executive Director of the Vermont Historical Society, Steve Perkins. What are we talking about today?
Oh, we're talking about crude oil, Texas tea.
Here in Vermont?
Well, we're going to talk about exploration, and specifically the guy who developed the modern oil drilling technique.
Okay, so who is he?
So his name was Edwin Drake. He was born right across the border in New York around 1819, but he grew up here in Castleton, lived on a farm right off of the modern-day Drake Road, and industrious as any Vermont farmer is, learned his way around machinery and what to do. Later in life, he went on and worked on the railroad, and he was a conductor, but ultimately, due to health issues, he semi-retired to Titusville, Pennsylvania. Titusville is where the oil industry really started in the U.S. And now, they weren't using oil for locomotion too much at the time, but saw it as a way of replacing whale oil. So the first stuff they started doing was refining this sludge that just kind of naturally bubbled out of the ground into kerosene. But this industry really started to grow and said, how can we more efficiently get this oil out of the ground? Edwin Drake had an idea. He said, let's take some well drilling techniques and see if we can get oil. And so he started drilling, but the sand and everything just kept collapsing around this. And this is 1858. Everyone's kind of laughing at him. Is this going to work? Is this going to work? He had a great idea. He said, what if we take iron pipes and we drive them down into the ground in 10-foot sections? You drive a 10-foot pipe down, and then you screw another pipe on top, and you drive it down. Once you get to bedrock, then you start drilling. Sure enough, in 1859, oil. And they could attach a pump to it. It was a hand pump, and they could pump that right out, and they stored it in an old bathtub, and they still use the same technique today. Oil drilling, they drive pipes, and then they drill down through, and it keeps the sand and dirt from collapsing.
So people think oil and they think money. Did it make him a very wealthy, successful man?
It really didn't. He was working for the Seneca Oil Company, and they made a ton of money on this. He was comfortable, but died soon after in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. But his name goes down in history as the guy who invented modern oil drilling techniques. And there's a museum, if you want to go visit, down in Pennsylvania, the Drake Oil Well Museum. You can see some of this early.
Okay, so going back to our notes, Edwin Drake, important person, maybe didn't get very rich off of his invention, but definitely changed our world. And side note there, the foundation of oil, I should say, one of the good things about using oil, it has its own environmental complications, of course, but we saved whales. Whales were used, their blubber was used to manufacture heating and light and oil for lighting. And using oil from the ground stopped us having to do that. Here's a picture of Edwin Drake on the right, and there's the first oil derrick, the first thing that was used to drill for oil. Next, we're going to talk about coal and iron. Two other major resources were coal and iron. Coal is important for heating homes and for manufacturing, especially in the manufacturing of steel. In 1870, 33 million tons were produced in the U.S. By 1900, it was 250 million. So great increase in 30 years. Iron itself was useful, but was even more important was a product which could be manufactured from iron, steel, the miracle metal, the magical metal. as it was sometimes referred to. Iron can break and rust. But when most of the carbon is removed from a mixture of iron, a strong, flexible metal called steel is made. Some carbon must remain. Between 0.5% and 1% of the mixture must remain, and that makes the iron become steel. The first cheap and efficient method for the creation of steel was the Bessemer process. Another one of our inventors here, Henry Bessemer, developed this in 1850. And it involved injecting air into molten iron. Steel production would catch on in such Midwest cities as Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Chicago. It would allow for the building of skyscrapers in these cities as well. Here's some pictures of the cities today. And Cleveland is on the bottom, Chicago is in the top left, and Pittsburgh is in the right corner there. Before we go on to the new inventions changing lives, let's watch another little video here. We're going to watch a video all about Pittsburgh.
You may think of Pittsburgh as a smoky city, but it ain't so. A century ago, we were earning our nickname, the Steel City. Our rivers were lined with towering smokestacks and enormous mills that glowed with fire. Most of those mills closed in the 1980s. We lost a lot of jobs, but Pittsburgh has rebounded. Now we're a clean, vital city. But let's look back to the early 1700s. European explorers saw the triangle of land defined by three rivers and knew they were standing before the gateway to the west. The French staked their claim. The British were not pleased, thus starting the French and Indian War. Remnants of this violent time are preserved at the point. We began making steel in 1812. This eventually created a class of wealthy industrial magnates. Chief among them were Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick. 100 years later, Pittsburgh was producing as much as half of the nation's steel. After World War II, the city launched a clean air and revitalization project known as the Renaissance. Now we're considered a green city, and the smoke is all in our past.
Here we go, back to our slideshow now, and we're going to focus a bit more on consumer inventions. We've talked about farming inventions and industrial inventions like the Bessemer process and the distillation process from oil into kerosene, and now we're going to talk about things like the telephone and the light bulb and other things that we use on a daily basis. The industrial boom would also bring new inventions to the U.S., and the standard of living or quality of life, the level of wealth and comfort available to a person, was positively affected by these inventions. Now, one guy we have to definitely talk about was Thomas Alva Edison. One of the inventions that he created was the incandescent light bulb in 1876 in Menlo Park, New Jersey. Now, he wasn't maybe the first guy to come up with something like the light bulb, but he was definitely the first to come up with a commercially viable light bulb. And that meant it could be sold at in large numbers to a mass amount of people. Here's a picture of Edison when he was young on the right with the phonograph, and there is Edison later on in life. After his success had come about, definitely. He developed an entire system for distributing electrical power. He would invent such notable items as the phonograph, which is the forerunner of the record player. He would invent the kinetoscope, which is a predecessor to the motion picture projector. And here you can see some of his inventions here. Phonograph on top, vitascope. This is what the vitascope or kinetoscope would look like. And of course, there's the light bulb in the middle. Now, electric power would catch on fast as it was cheap and efficient. It could be used to power any number of devices and allowed manufacturers to locate their plants anywhere they wanted. It also allowed cities to grow. And this is where we're going to stop for a second and look at at Edison, but we're also going to look at one of his employees and later competitors, Nikola Tesla. Now, for a very long time, Nikola Tesla was kind of ignored and obscure, but with the advent of Elon Musk and his car company named Tesla, became more popular and more publicly known. Here's a little video about Nikola Tesla.
Nikola Tesla was born on July 10, 1856, in the territory of modern-day Croatia, to his two Serbian parents. Tesla grew up into a bright, inquisitive, yet eccentric child who found himself fascinated by the world around him. Tesla once tried to fly by jumping off the roof of a barn while holding onto an umbrella. He devised a bug-powered motor using June bugs, but had to abort his experiment after a friend decided to eat some of the bugs. Tesla once attempted to generate electricity by rubbing two cats together, which resulted in two very mad cats and a scratched-up Tesla. On June 6, 1884, Tesla arrived in the United States. He was hired by Thomas Edison to do basic electrical engineering, but moved up to redesigning the direct current generators that ran Edison's business. Edison offered Tesla $50,000, or about $1.1 million in today's currency, to make these improvements. After completing this assignment, Tesla asked about the payment for his work. Edison didn't pay out the money. He claimed that he wasn't serious about the payment, that Tesla didn't understand American humor. Tesla eventually left Edison's company and partnered with George Westinghouse in 1888 to commercialize his system of alternating current. The problem here is that alternating current competed with direct current, which Thomas Edison built his entire monopoly on. Thus began the war of the currents. Edison started a massive smear campaign against Tesla and alternating current, trying to scare people away from using it. He spread false information about it, lobbied against its use, and went so far as to electrocute a circus elephant in public. Basically, Edison was a jerk. Direct current had plenty of its own faults. It was the cause of death of countless children and created numerous house fires. Also, the maximum reach of direct current was about 2 miles, which meant a substation had to be built to continue the current. To this day, they would still be building substations if they were going to get electricity across the U.S. Tesla's alternating current could go for hundreds of miles. Lights running on alternate current were bright white, unlike dull yellow lights running on direct current. Eventually, Edison had to give in to the demands of the people and had to go with alternating current. Tesla's influence spreads much further than electricity. He had over 700 patents and came up with ideas such as robots, spark plugs, the electric arc lamp, an X-ray device, bladeless turbines, wireless communication, laser technology, neon lights, remote control, cellular communication, radio, an electrical bath to remove germs, radar, and much more. Tesla died from heart failure in a room of the New York hotel on January 7, 1943. Despite his fame and influence on the world, he died with significant debts and all alone. While Edison is known as the inventor of the century, Tesla is only acknowledged as a paragraph in today's history books, forgotten and unappreciated. Thus ends the story of Nikola Tesla, genius and inventor.
Okay, I think we have to look at that with a discerning eye and understand that there is bias in that video, but there also is truth. If you look at that automatically, I think we think, oh, he's biased against Thomas Edison. And yeah, that is going on in that video. But we have to remember that Thomas Edison, while, yeah, he did not necessarily treat his employees so well at times, was a very brilliant man, and we wouldn't have some of the things that we have if it weren't for him. But also, please remember that, Edison was a businessman as well as an inventor and was always looking to make money. And that came at the expense of Nikola Tesla, at least in that one case. And Nikola Tesla could have been more well-known than he was if it weren't for Thomas Edison. So we have to look at both sides of the story. And we'll look at Thomas Edison's bio in a little bit.
Thomas Edison was born in Millen, Ohio on February 11, 1847. He didn't learn to talk until he was almost 4 years old. In school, he often daydreamed and was labeled as mentally slow by his teacher. Because of these comments, young Edison's mother took him out of school and homeschooled him. In 1854, his family moved to Port Huron, Michigan. Edison sold candy and newspapers on trains. He became a telegraph operator after saving the daughter of a station agent from an oncoming train. He moved to Louisville, Kentucky in 1866 and became an employee of Western Union. Starting in 1872, Edison worked on the quadruplex telegraph system. It allowed telegraphs to send and receive 4 signals at the same time on the same wire. Edison's system wasn't a new invention, but an improvement on the duplex system created by Moses G. Farmer and Joseph Stearns. Edison's first invention was a phonograph in 1877. Many people today incorrectly associate the phonograph with a record player. Edison's device recorded sound on its cylinders and was geared as a recorder for the voice, not for recording and playing back music. It was the gramophone that recorded to discs, and became the record player that we know today. Edison did not invent the first electric light bulb. He invented the first commercially practical incandescent light. Edison bought the patent on what was probably the first invented light bulb. Later, he came across Joseph Wilson Swan, who had developed and patented a working light bulb. Edison made Swan a partner and eventually bought him and his patent out, giving him full ownership of the patent. Edison patented a system for electrical distribution in 1880 in order to capitalize on his electric lamps. Edison used direct current to power his system, which had its limitations, and when these limitations were made public, Edison launched a propaganda campaign to convince people of the superiority of direct current. This War of the Currents, as it was called, brought in the involvement of Nikola Tesla, an inventor and rival of Edison who had created the alternating current power generator. Alternating current eventually proved to be a better system of transmitting power. In 1888, Edison started working on inventing a motion picture camera. Edison passed on the work of creating the camera to one of his assistants. Edison himself had very little involvement in the invention. On May 20th, 1891, the kinetoscope and the kinetograph were revealed. Moving images were taken with the kinetograph and shown through a peephole on the kinetoscope. Some of the things that Edison filmed with this early motion picture camera included a man doing tricks on his single-gear bike and 2 cats boxing with each other. One of the lesser-known ideas of Edison was concrete furniture. It came from a failed attempt at making concrete houses. Edison used what was supposedly a lightweight foam concrete to manufacture various home furnishings. Edison shipped out some of his furnishings to put them on display, but they arrived broken up. This caused Edison to close down his line of concrete creations for good. Many today consider Edison to have been an atheist, but this is not true. Edison had spiritual and religious beliefs that were a mix between pantheism and deism. Thomas Edison never really invented major breakthroughs. He took credit for the inventions of others, and most of his patents were modifications on already existing ideas. Edison was, however, a very good businessman, and used his business skills to improve on current ideas instead of inventing new ones. Edison died of complications of diabetes on October 18, 1931. While there are lesser-known inventors who have done greater things than Edison and are more deserving of the praises and rewards given to him, there is no doubt that he certainly had an impact on the world. So ends the history of Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison was born in...
Okay, and so it's a bit more of the other side of the story of Thomas Edison. He wasn't, maybe it's quite the innovator, if we look at him with a discerning eye, as other people were, but he was an important person when it comes to developing better versions of the innovations he came across. And so, catching up here, again, I think we have to always look at people in history with a scrutinizing eye. We have to be looking at the good and the bad that they did. We can't be all bad, we can't be all good. We have to look at everything as a whole and come to our own conclusions about that person. Christopher Sholes is the next one we're going to look at. He invented the typewriter, which would change the business world in 1867, improve our standard of living by making it much easier to write as opposed to handwritten things, and also making it easier to read what was presented to us. Here's a picture of Sholes on the left and the typewriter on the right. And the typewriter, eventually the patent for it, Sholes didn't make too much money off it. He sold the patent to Remington, the gun manufacturer. And they were able to make more money off of it than he did. Let's watch a short video here all about Christopher Sholes and the typewriter. Let's close out the Tesla Edison stuff, and here we go.
To a good chunk of our viewing audience, there once was a time when us earthlings typed with all 10 of our fingers instead of just our thumbs. And instead of typing on screens, we did it on mysterious machines that didn't even plug in. I know this may all be too much for you to handle at this time of day. Oh, we also use something called paper in these contraptions. But we'll save that for another show. We need to pace ourselves. Typewriters made their debut in the late 1800s, just as the world was seeing an explosion in communications technology. At the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation, I walked back in time to the early era of the typewriter with curator Kristen Gallerno. What is the brand name here?
This is a Scholes and Glidden.
Scholes and Glidden.
This was invented by Christopher Scholes. He was a printer working in Milwaukee, and he was working on a machine called a paginator. It's a machine that is able to type numbers onto pages. His friend, Carlos Glidden, shows him this magazine article about a machine called a pterotype. And that machine inspires Christopher Scholes to create the typewriter.
Interesting. And this is an American invention.
Yes, in Milwaukee.
The Scholes and Glidden is the first commercially successful typewriter, but success didn't happen overnight. Does it create a sensation?
Not immediately. So at first, nobody really knows what to do with it. A typewriter is sort of a paradox because it has to be really heavy and you have to be able to bang away on the keys, right? But it's also a very precise machine. So it takes a really long time to figure out how to manufacture these things until 1874.
It also has to be able to survive an angry reporter on deadline.
Exactly.
Right?
Right. Yeah.
Take a quick look at your phone or computer keyboard, and you'll see it looks a lot like this one from the 19th century. Yes, the keyboard layout on the Scholes and Glidden is the one we still use today. There's a reason the letters are arranged in this way, Q-W-E-R-T-Y.
The reason why the keyboard is arranged in this QWERTY arrangement is to avoid having the type basket letters get all tangled up. The letters that you use most commonly together are going to be in the furthest possible position from one another in that type basket.
By the late 1880s, the typewriter started to impact the American office worker and the overall office environment.
Women were mostly working in mills, and the office was mostly filled with men in the 1870s, and there was a shift in the 1880s. By 1910, most of the professional typists, about 80%, were actually women.
Since the early typewriter models were so loud, there was an attempt to create a quiet one.
This is the no-din typewriter.
This is very beautiful.
It is, yeah, and it's the only one that exists. If you think of the word din, that means noisy, right?
Oh my goodness.
So it's like no din.
Did they mean that?
They absolutely did.
It wasn't somebody's name.
No, it wasn't.
We didn't even wade into the electric typewriter models. But, just so that I can have that old-time feeling, is there something you got that I can type on?
I think we can make that happen.
Boy, I hate writing, but I love typing.
And there you saw, his name is Mo Rocca, and Mo Rocca was working for the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan, doing a story about Christopher Scholes and the typewriter. Last one we need to talk about here is Alexander Graham Bell, and his telephones would have a great impact. Made in 1876, Bell, who was born in Europe, not in the United States, made the phone, and it paved the way for worldwide communications. You could now have long-distance communication instantaneously. You didn't have to wait on the telegraph, which utilized Morse code, and somebody who had to know Morse code to get the information across. You didn't have to rely on letters anymore. Now you could have personal communication, emergency communication, business communication. You could have it all at once. Bell would also be the first to develop the metal detector, interestingly enough. And here on the left-hand side, we see one of the earlier telephones, maybe not one of the first telephones, but one of the earlier telephones, and a picture of Bell on the right-hand side himself. And you would have watched the great inventors on our Google Classroom page, and you would have learned a little bit more about Bell there. And these new inventions and the rise of industry made some people very rich, as we've talked about. And so in our next unit, which is all about big business and labor, we're going to examine the tycoons, the robber barons, as they were sometimes called, and see not the people who were under threat, like the farmers or the inventors who were sometimes passed by the wayside. We're going to look at the guys who really benefited from this industrial age. Hey folks, this is Mr. Miller. I hope you enjoyed that video all about how the United States transferred from an agricultural society to an industrial society. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, and if you enjoy my videos, please subscribe. Probably not talking to too many people outside of Zanesville when I say that. Hope that you're watching this far in the future and that we have come through COVID unscathed. It has not been easy, but we're hanging in there. Your teachers care about you and want the best for you, and will be there for you. Have a great day, guys.